So, Nadia, I know you wrote an article at least a few weeks ago now comparing the coronavirus to climate activism and kind of finding those similarities between the two. I think that'd be a great jumping off point for this discussion. So I'd love to hear more about that in detail and what that was all about.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the pandemic here in Massachusetts, when it was really clear it was going to have a really big impact on everyone's lives, I wrote an article suggesting the ways in which climate activists could really help us understand how to deal with this crisis of the pandemic, and then how the pandemic can also help us prepare for future climate and ecological crises down the road. So I used the 4 demands of Extinction Rebellion, which are: 1, tell the truth. If we don't tell the truth, then we cannot address the crisis. And the truth often is inconvenient, but we can't deal with any problem if we're not really looking it in the face. And often that means we have to listen to the experts and really discern carefully what it is that they're saying and look at the whole truth. Number 2 is act now. Had China, for example, told the truth and acted immediately, then the pandemic could have been controlled faster. Now, I'm not blaming the Chinese, but the Chinese government is an authoritarian government that doesn't like to deal with inconvenient truths. And governments, not only China, but the US government, very much so, doesn't like to deal with inconvenient truths. And that leads us to a lot of problems. So we have to act now. We can't wait. And I think we'll talk about that more because it's a little bit different for the pandemic and for the climate crisis. 3 is beyond politics. And we've seen with the pandemic how polarized different positions are. And it makes it really hard to tell the truth and really see the nuances of a situation if 2 sides get entrenched and can't come together to see the complexity and work together. So this isn't a political issue. It is a matter of truth and working towards a healthier, better, safer future. And in the US, the 4th demand of Extinction Rebellion is just transition, because there's so much inequity that it's absolutely essential that we protect the most vulnerable. And all of our planning is done in a way that takes into account how everything we do will affect the most vulnerable. And we've seen in New York City in particular, I was just looking at the numbers really recently, the death rates for people of color is at least twice and often more.
I think it's 2.5 on average.
Yes.
Yeah.
Times. So that's really illustrating the systemic inequity of our society, as so many things about this pandemic are, and we have to address them as we are planning for our future. And so those are the 4 demands of Extinction Rebellion, and I think they're just super helpful to think about how to address a pandemic or any crisis. And then the 5th kind of ask or vision is to build a regenerative culture. And it's really that regenerative culture vision that I think is most exciting. And actually, Ryan, you said something that really interested me, which was I was talking about the similarities between coronavirus and the climate and ecological crisis. And you said, well, there are these really big differences too. And I think it's related to that regenerative culture. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of those differences.
Yeah, happy to. First, though, I just want to say I think that framework is super useful as a lens for viewing this and seeing what's gone wrong, what we could do better, and how to approach these kinds of issues next time, because there are so many similarities between the two. And the very first thing you said was telling the truth. And if we can get better as a society in listening to the science, which is our best tool at our disposal for finding truth, and kind of act from a common set of facts, like so much else kind of falls into place. That's a whole different discussion. But anyway, there's a lot in those 4 or 5 points you made that I think are worth diving into. But yeah, in terms of differences, there's a few that stick out, but I think the biggest one is also the most important one. And that's just for people to understand that climate and corona are different in that to address coronavirus, we're all sacrificing, and we should be. I mean, we are prioritizing people and life and well-being, but it's not, we're paying a cost to do that in terms of, staying home, being away from our loved ones, and that social distancing. Like, it's not fun. It's not ideal. You're going to say something?
Yeah, and I think the economic cost also, this is one of the areas where it's been politicized, but people are really, really struggling financially. And I just want to acknowledge that too. And it has real life consequences. Yeah.
There's so much suffering. People are losing their jobs in droves, tens of millions. And then you look on the flip side for climate action. If we are going to solve climate change, what does that look like? What does that mean? And you see that this is just a win-win-win all around. It's going to improve people's health. We're going to have to come together and work together to solve this. And just overall, it's making our lives better, not worse. We need literally millions of people to solve this problem. And in a way, it really is I'm obviously biased. We're going to talk about this more in depth, but it is this solution just sitting in our back pocket to get us out of this coronavirus mess. And not only to get us out of the mess, but to solve the next enormous looming problem at the same time. Put people to work, improve our health, and make society more resilient.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a really exciting report that the Sierra Club just put out saying that it has a plan to create 9 million new jobs per year for at least the next 7 years in green infrastructure. And so where coronavirus is making us lose jobs, investing in green energy, investing in our future is a job builder. And it builds better jobs. Mm-hmm. People, okay, they can't work in mines anymore, but that is a very painful, difficult, dangerous job with a very poor quality of life. We can create better jobs for people across the board in all kinds of really interesting areas. So I think that's really very, very exciting. And you were talking about...
And that's an important part of the solution too. Taking care of these workers in these industries who are working in fossil fuels and making sure that they have a just transition to work in this cleaner economy or in whatever jobs they'd like to find. But just like really centering people in this transformation, because there is going to be a lot of disruption and it's for the best. But you need to be mindful when these changes happen to take care of everyone along the way.
Exactly. I think there's often a perception that caring for the environment is caring for like polar bears. And hey, I care about polar bears. I mean, it's actually incredibly tragic to imagine that, the world I grew up in, polar bears, it never would have crossed my mind that we'd be talking about the extinction of so many species. This is very essential. But there isn't a separation between the animals and the people. We have to, this is about people. This is about people's lives. It's about investing in a livable world for people. Mm-hmm. And there's no separation between the environment we live in and ourselves, our health, our well-being, and our ability to survive. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
I feel like we so often, especially in higher income countries, take for granted like the basic foundations of society, which are like food, water, a safe place to live. And climate change, the climate emergency, is threatening each one of those things. And so it's really just this fundamental idea that we are completely dependent on nature and a part of it, not separate from and better than it. Yeah. So like really coding that into our laws and our society and the way we live so that we are in harmony with our world that we depend on, instead of just, destroying it and thus only hurting ourselves.
Yeah, there's such a weird paradox in American culture around the idea of nature. I mean, there's so much to say about that, but even what is nature and what is wilderness, and our love as Americans of nature and our fear of nature, right? I mean, Betsy DeVos says, okay, we can have guns in school so we can kill bears. Like, what a weird country this is. But there's this love and fear of nature that we have in America, of like wilderness and wildness. But there's this strange paradox that's going on now, because actually nature we can live in harmony with it. And I think that we forget that in the US, right? We've forgotten that, which are really indigenous people here, like Native Americans knew that. Yep. And we had to, like, the national identity was in opposition to Native identity. So that harmony that people had here for thousands and thousands of years got disrupted, and a whole different mindset came in. But there's this strange paradox now where we're neither able to see the ways in which we're able to live in harmony with nature, but also strangely, our kind of cultural imagination of how powerful and dangerous nature can be also seems to be partly forgotten, at least by certain parts of our culture, especially ones in the White House now, right? Because the other day there was just high winds here, and I was like, wow, those are really powerful. I hope my house is going to be okay.
Yeah.
There could be a storm and it could come through, and goodbye New York City.
Yeah. And
there's harmony, and there's also just the force of nature. And we need to get back to harmony so that we can protect ourselves from nature really unleashing her enormous, overwhelming force that is going to be so much more disruptive.
Yeah.
The coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah. I do think, though, building on that the coronavirus is opening our eyes, at least some people's eyes, for the first time, that everything is much more fragile than we like to believe. We are not invincible as people or as a society, and we're really at the mercy of nature at certain times when it gets going. And it's kind of like, it's a weird analogy, but it's kind of like when you're growing up, you think everything, or I had this for a while, living in a bubble. Like, everything's under control. Like, they're the best. And you have that realization that your parents are just people at some point. And then you have the same realization with society at another point. And that's like, oh, no one actually knows what they're doing. No one knows what's going on. This whole thing is not under control or necessarily moving in the right direction. And you have to be an active participant in it to try to help shape it. And I think that this pandemic is kind of waking some people up to some of those realizations, or a reminder, if you've already had them, to be like, these physical forces are completely out of our control at times. And if you don't figure them out, you're at the mercy of them, really. And with Corona, it's really bad. And with climate, especially with the path we're on, it's going to be way, way worse. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so the most we can do is to be proactive and try to take care of ourselves and take care of our earth. And it's just like, this is a wake up call, right? You think you're going along, nothing changes, and all of a sudden, boom. I mean, here, my husband's a high school teacher. He was kind of waiting, but he went to school one day, and then 5 o'clock, you can't come back the next day.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it for the entire rest of the school year. Suddenly, so quickly, things change.
Yeah.
So if we can, prepare beforehand, I think the illusion that things are just going to keep on going in the same way
Mm-hmm.
has been, for many people, disrupted by this pandemic.
Yeah.
And so if we can really be wise and think, okay, this is a reset. How can we use this moment to create a more resilient future? Because we've seen that really we don't, as a society, have things set up for a rainy day. And that's an expression that people use, right? But we're going to get not just rains, but storms, droughts, floods, a lot of disruption. And how do we both mitigate that, and we can talk about specifically what we need to do with carbon dioxide, which the scientists have been telling us and telling us and telling us and telling us. And also, how do we prepare our culture to make those transitions?
Yeah. Yeah. I have a couple thoughts. There's so much here. One is just on the water and flooding front. I think I'll have to double check this, but Michigan just had a couple dams break, or at least one dam break, and thousands of people had to evacuate. And this is mid-coronavirus. So you have these compounding crises stacking up on top of each other. We're really not ready for it at all. But the other part of that is that the month of April was like one of, if not the most precipitation that Michigan has gotten in, X period of time. It's everything is moving at this accelerating exponential pace. And we really do need to get ahead of it, because prevention is always going to be better, safer, and cheaper than, waiting it out and trying to react and adapt and just like flail. There's actually, last thing here, there's this really good quote from Kim Cobb, but she's talking about Corona and climate change. And she says, both demand early and aggressive action to minimize loss. Only in hindsight will we really understand what we gambled on and what we lost by not acting early enough. And you can see that right now with coronavirus, and you're going to be able to see it. It's only going to be magnified with climate change, which is an era. This is like a whole 21st century problem.